Okay, good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here early on a Saturday morning. It's very exciting. And I'm very happy to have this wonderful audience here and to be doing the, I guess, final plenary of this really fantastic conference. Penultimate, excuse me, just kidding. There will be another plenary, don't go away. I'm Zinaida Miller. I'm gonna be moderating this particular roundtable. So I'm gonna first introduce our four speakers here, and then I'll say a couple of just quick remarks, and then I'm gonna open it up to them to get started, and then we'll do a little bit of Q&A. So first we have Ashley Farmer, who's Assistant Professor of African and African Diaspora Studies at the University of Texas at Austin. Kelly Gillespie, Senior Lecturer in Anthropology and Sociology at the University of the Western Cape in Cape Town. Aparna Polavarapu.
Yes.
Okay. Polavarapu, Associate Professor of Law, University of South Carolina Law School, and Vanessa Thompson, who is postdoctoral researcher and lecturer at the Institute of Sociology at the Goethe University in Frankfurt. And I'm not going to say a huge amount. They each have amazing work and fantastic bios, but I'm not going to say a lot about it, in part because I'm going to give them the minutes to go a little bit more in depth into their own work, which will reflect a lot of the kinds of themes and work that they've been doing. And so just to get started, I'm going to kind of lay out three rough themes that I think you'll see emerging with each of them and over the course of sort of four discussions and Q&A. The first is that we're trying to foreground notions about temporal as well as spatial exchange and transfer. So by that I mean that highlighting the ways in which both practices around policing and prisons, but also practices around dissidence and resistance and abolition, travel through time as well as through space, and then to do some thinking collectively about what that means. The second theme is to think a little bit about the human rights abolition question and put them back into, or to continue to put them into conversation, maybe particularly around how we think about human rights practices of justice in different places and abolitionism, and also to some extent strategic uses of legal and political discourses that can sometimes be empowering and sometimes demobilizing, and to think about how context and site-specific practices feed into that. And the third idea is really to think a little bit about how categories around past, present, and future are mobilized politically and legally. So how do we mobilize different temporal periods in terms of practices that might foreground short-term fixes versus or kind of solutions to problems versus thinking about really long-term nature of structures of distribution in terms of abolitionists and other projects. And how we figure and think about the past in these kinds of projects. So what role does the past and past violence play as we think through different political and legal projects. And also the last thing I just want to note before turning it over to everyone here is that this is a very interdisciplinary panel. So we have four speakers coming from, I believe, four different disciplines, which is really fantastic. And for that reason, I've given them an extra couple of minutes to start out with, because I think grounding and contextualizing the work that they do will really help to make the discussion a little bit richer so that we can think also about kind of method and modes of analysis as well as the subjects that everyone studies. So with that, I'm going to give each of them just a few minutes to introduce their work and how they think about these particular types of questions, and then I will ask them a couple questions, and then I hope all of you will ask them some questions. So, Ashley.
All right.
Here.
First on deck. Oh, is this, which one? This one's for me? Okay. Good morning, everyone. It's exciting to see your faces for another day. I'd like to thank the conference organizers for bringing us all together. And I can very much remember a time when the term abolition was not very much used in relationship to prisons, and let alone a concept that many folks were aware of. So I'm just really excited to be here in this moment for having this conversation and the things that I'm sure will be generated and come out of it that are useful and productive. So I'm a historian of Black women's history, and I now focus on Black women's role in developing the reparations struggle. So when we decided that I would speak first, perhaps like some of you, I thought I would really bring up the rear of the panel, because when we think about reparations, we think about often how we repair or deal with redress for things that have happened after the fact. But I really appreciate the opportunity to start off this conversation because it offers me, and hopefully you guys as well, a chance to talk about how we might think about how US Black women's understandings of reparations activism was more than just a past justice-focused project, but rather one that prepared many of us in the US to think about how abolition in its many iterations. In other words, I'd like us to start off by thinking about how Black women reparations activists were some of the principal alchemists of abolitionist methods, ideas, and practices, and simply injecting the idea in our national consciousness that there can be, and there has to be, another way. In the United States, we think about two Black women as the founders of the reparations movement. In particular, we speak about Callie House and Queen Mother Audley Moore. And these are two women that worked primarily at the grassroots level and are very much are not known, are kind of starting to get their due. So House was actually born a slave in Rutherford County near Nashville, Tennessee, my hometown. Anybody from Nashville? No? Okay. It's always a rough crowd on the Nashville front. Not many people want to claim Tennessee. In 1891, a pamphlet entitled The Freedmen's Pension Bill, a plea for American freedmen, began circulating around Black communities in central Tennessee. And this pamphlet espoused the idea of a financial compensation as a means for rectifying the ills of slavery. And House became involved because of this pamphlet that she saw. She chartered something called the National Ex-Slave Mutual Relief Bounty and Pension Association, again, the longest name ever, in 1898, and was named the secretary of this organization. And during her tenure, the association's membership developed to 34,000 mainly former slaves, mainly through their efforts. And by 1900, its nationwide reach was around 300,000. So that's saying something for a slave born in Tennessee to kind of create a reparations movement of this level. So House's organization functioned as a part advocacy group, a part mutual aid society, but also a way to advocate for reparations. Yet in her rhetoric and writings, the formerly enslaved woman and guiding intellectual argued that the federal government owed slaves for Black pay for labor stolen from them after the adoption of the Declaration of Independence. And throughout her writing, and she has kind of a copious body of writing around reparations, and I'll add that she was always employing the language of slavery abolitionists, so we see the long lineage happening right there, that Black people had the right to be in America, that they had the right to their own labor, and that the United States could not continue along the same path of refusing to acknowledge its rightful Black people as its rightful human beings and citizens. A Black woman living and working in a community that looked a little different from the one that she was born into as a slave roused thousands of everyday Black people to think there has to be another way. A little further south and about a century later, Audley Moore took up the reparations cause. Moore was born in New Iberia, Louisiana, and politicized in the 1920s and 30s by Marcus Garvey's UNIA and the Communist Party. And eventually she became kind of the mother of the movement. That's why we call her Queen Mother. And she mentored the likes of Malcolm X, the Black Panther Party, and many other African nation-state leaders. So Moore, like House, engaged in grassroots women-centered reparations organizing in order to collect signatures and petition the government to take up the issue of reparations and formulate a reparations plan. And one of the things I think is really important to note about the way Queen Mother Moore talked about reparations is she suggested that the government pay a predetermined amount of money to the descendants of slaves with no restrictions on how the money was spent. In Moore's vision, reparations worked best when each recipient could use their funds to prepare and advance their lives as they saw fit. She staunchly opposed trickle-down approaches to economics and plans for Black churches or the Black elite to distribute reparations, and thought that each person should be in charge of their own life in doing so. And in this kind of approach, Moore offered another way for us to not only think about reparations, but also hierarchies and repair and the cooperative economics within the Black community, or who should be in charge of how we understand and make people whole. So although they were organizing in different times, more in the 20th century, House in the 19th century, I think there's a couple of things that unite their work. First, their work indicates a clear economic analysis of white supremacy. And embedded in their critique of the relationship between using Black people for profit during slavery is criminalizing Black people and incarcerating them for profit. And when I'm talking about profit, I mean broadly conceived, not just kind of in the private prison way, once slavery was no longer legal. Second, both women built on and relied on global solidarity and international networks to foreground the importance of reparations and to build a widespread community for their cause. And they both, well, really more because the UN didn't exist. More in the 20th century appealed directly to the UN on behalf of reparations for African Americans. Third, these women were expressly concerned with thinking about how the state has defined citizenship and who gets the rights to citizenship, a framework that we see at the heart of issues of the carceral state. And finally, through their lives, both women adopted a strategy in which they appealed to the federal government for redress, while also setting up alternative forms of community support and restitution outside the state-sanctioned models that were available to them. So indeed, at the core of both House and Moore's work was the goal of acknowledging the harms of people and thinking about how we might make Black people whole. And here I mean economically, but also psychologically and physically for the harms done during slavery. They declared that slavery and its devastating effects were not just blips on an otherwise fully functioning democratic model, but rather the root of inequality and the corrosiveness of a democracy. House and Moore labored across political, cultural, and organizational sites, insisting that Black people's second-class citizenship was not an inevitable outgrowth of slavery, but rather a uniquely designed project to make us believe that this is the natural order of things. Laboring on the margins of both Black and white communities for many years, slowly but steadily gaining traction as a trickle of followers for their cause, ostracized for most of their lives, called crazy and unrealistic by most. And in the case of House, jailed for their efforts. You know, if you want to get a Black radical, you get them for mail fraud, right? So it's all, mail fraud is the government's go-to. And so she was indicted of mail fraud for basically selling these pensions. We see that happen again with Garvey and going on, right? But they were constantly told the day when reparations was more than a term that few Black people knew, that that day would never come when a member of the government would entertain a reparations claim. Yet they held on to the idea that there could be another way. Another way to think about slavery and how it affects all of us. Another way to think about Black people's relationship to the nation state. Another way of organizing Black leadership in economics. Another way to use the atrocities that we experience to bring us together. Another way to build the future. And they had an unwavering faith that this day would come when people would understand both the necessity and the healing power of acknowledging a wrong and the restorative potential of reorganizing how we think a society can function. And given the recent events, I think that, you know, they would say some of that day has come, right? Most importantly, they did that painstaking, sometimes life-risking work of asking us to take up past harms and use them in service of imagining a different future. Or as Professor Gilmore reminded us, they were committed to that militantly practical pursuit of a different future through a range of programs for repairing cultural and economic and political devastation. And did the ethos of reparations and abolition has always gone hand in hand? And Women in Moore and House introduced wide swaths of the Black community and those outside of it to some of its central ideas and strategies and goals. Through their reparations campaigns, they empowered everyday people to think about how addressing the past might help them better understand the present and prepare for the future. Their movements became a gateway for everyday Black folks to think about how their lives, their communities, and the US nation state might be imagined in different ways. So propelled by their work in this spirit, I'm excited to offer them as the foundation of our conversation today and think about how we can talk about different ways of victimhood, redress, and how this can be more incorporated into abolitionist politics. Thank you.
Thank you, that was great. I have a...
Oh, you got the presentation. You're fancy at presentation.
The tyranny of PowerPoint, sorry. You wait. That's not mine. Yeah. Should say Texas. That's mine, yeah. So part of the brief, part of the brief for this conversation. Thank you so much. I just pressed the. Was to think about time, transitional justice, and South Africa, which is where I work and what I work on. You know, the emblematic figure of processes of time and transitional justice is the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. So I'm going to focus my my remarks today on some of the forgotten terms, the deliberately forgotten terms of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. But first, just a thanks to conference organizers for the invitation and for the marvelous collection of people that have been brought together. So in the historiography of the South African transition to flag democracy in the 1990s, there's a curious hole that exists about a significant set of historical events. It's as if they didn't happen in the way we talk about the transition in South Africa, and I'm pretty sure most of you won't know about these sets of events, which was a massive series of prison riots that happened right in 93, 94, 95 in South Africa, at the very moment of the first democratic elections. And the first wave of these prison riots took shape around the question of franchise. So there was a debate going on nationally about whether prisoners should have the right to vote. And so prisoners were very clear on their position. You'll remember that many of the leaders that were going into the new government at the time, including Nelson Mandela, had directly stepped out of apartheid prisons, right? So the politics of prisons and incarceration was very much part of that moment. So prisoners were very clear on their right to vote. The prison riots that took shape in that moment forced a national concession around a prison franchise, and from that moment to today, all prisoners have universal right to vote as long as they have the documentation to do so inside. The prison riots took a very interesting shape in this first wave, which was the use of fire inside of prison cells. And it was very difficult for prison warders and guards to get into cells that were locked and that were set alight. So the process of riot in that moment, that early moment of the prison riots around the transition, took the form of a kind of self-immolation, right, which directly mapped onto a politics of, do I count as a citizen, right? What does my body mean in terms of a national politics? And it was an extreme effort to signify the right to matter in terms of the vote and national franchise. Very powerful and important series of protests. And an indication of the kind of civil death that the withholding of the vote would mean for prisoners. Once that right to franchise was won, the next set of riots that took place in prison took a remarkably different form. And prisons began to rumble with a kind of ungovernability that became really pronounced, even though now forgotten. Franchise riots began to take shape around a different kind of politics, and it was a politics of amnesty. And that's really what I want to get to today. This was at the same moment that the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was being planned. So 1996 was the beginning of the TRC, and there was a lot of talk about how to deal with historic violence by the white state, particularly around grievous bodily harm, which became the mandate for the TRC. And so amnesty and what to do with the politics of amnesty was very much part of the national conversation, and it was a politics that prisoners began to get involved in. So in Modderby prison, which is a huge prison just south of Johannesburg, the riots began to take the form of a kind of controversy around the terms of imprisonment itself. So rather than a kind of self-immolation within the cell, prisoners began to start overwhelming guards and warders, stealing keys, and releasing themselves from the cells, releasing other prisoners from cells. So what began to take shape was a politics of release, right? A politics of refusal of the very conditions of incarceration. So in those riots, you started to see the unlocking, the forcing into prison courtyards, the conversion of prison courtyards from a place of daily exercise into a place of meeting and occupation. And you began to see the beginnings of burstings, right, of taking down the prison gates themselves. So in one instance, about 150 prisoners actually burst through the gates and managed to escape. Some managed to find tunnels to escape out of. This was met by riot police and bullets. And the reason why this next phase of the riots took shape was because prisoners were beginning to articulate a politics of amnesty that said, if the conversation is on the table that white perpetrators of apartheid violence should be given amnesty, then why should we not be given amnesty too, right? And it was an incredibly important political moment that is utterly forgotten, right, in the historiography of this moment. And so in this moment of riot, some of the ANC leaders were sent to the prison. Actually, our current president was one of the people that went to the prison. And in the negotiation, 6 months amnesty was offered, right? So this is 6 months reduction on prison terms. That's it. So prisoners started to get really angry. And in a prison in the Eastern Cape, and I think this is my favorite riot from the period, prisoners began dismantling the prison itself. I mean, they literally began prizing bricks out of the wall and using the bricks of the prison walls as weapons to fight their way into amnesty and out of the prison, right? So there was a real debate about the function and existence of the prison itself. There was a dismantling of physical prisons going on in the politics of these prison riots. And in that moment, prisoners got together through an emergent prison union, also which has been now forgotten, and they drafted this letter. I just want to read it because I think it's pretty amazing. I can't read it, and I don't have it with me. Sorry, I'm going to come over here and read it. We, the above-mentioned prisoners, wish to express our displeasure about the way in which amnesty is being granted to prisoners. As we are prisoners who've been in prison since the Botha de Klerk apartheid government, we feel the government is still prejudicing us by giving only a certain number of months, 6 months, amnesty, while we know that a minority will benefit therefrom. If we take, and this is my italics, if we take into account that apartheid was the reason for many criminals committing crimes, and that prisons are overcrowded as a result of such injustice, we must insist on the release of all prisoners. Apartheid is the cause of unemployment and disinvestment, as also the social and economic collapse in everyone's life, especially the criminals. If a political prisoner, a person who committed murder with a political motive, can so readily be forgiven with an indemnity, what about forgiveness for the criminal who transgressed because apartheid created unemployment and who tried to feed his dependents? Why should we be satisfied with 6 months while we also plead for forgiveness? President Nelson Mandela, you speak of forgive and forget. Why is the arm of forgiveness not extended to us? Why can we not be given a chance in the new South Africa so that we can play a part? We ask indemnity be granted to all prisoners, right? I mean, this is a letter that has absolutely no bearing on the current politics of the democratic order, right? But I think it's extremely important to retrieve these archival moments if we want to understand the history of political claims and think about how we might augment them in the present. So it's also important to understand that this claim was being made precisely at the moment of absorption of the kinds of political economic commitments of Mandela and the ANC to processes of redistribution, to connection to communist politics, to forms of nationalization and redistribution of wealth. Right? So Mandela comes out of prison, and the first speech he gives when he comes out of prison is that it's inconceivable to imagine that the wealth of South Africa will not be nationalized. A few years later, the ANC is part of international, driven largely by Washington, processes of absorbing the ANC into an increasingly neoliberalizing consensus, right? And it's also the historical moment that created what some call lawfare, and the proliferation of constitution making across much of what was called the Third World, the insertion of anti-colonial and anti-apartheid energies into the work of reform and liberal statecraft, right? So this politics of abolition that's coming out of prisons is really a politics that is contesting the way in which the elite political prisoners that leave prison and enter into liberal statecraft politics get to separate themselves out from what are called common law prisoners who no longer have recourse to a politics of redistribution and radical state-making. So the question then is, which is so important to ask, is for whom is this amnesty? If amnesty is at heart a political intervention into the ordinary workings of criminal law, a politics that remains available to all of us, right, remains available as we do not need to think of criminal law as hegemonic. There is a long history of political intervention into the workings of criminal law. And amnesty is one of these mechanisms. How do we think of the political purposes to which amnesty is put? What are the social effects of specific acts of amnesty? So the great beauty in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was in its capacity to fulfill the mandate laid out in many radical black and decolonial treaties, which was that the forgiveness of the oppressor creates the conditions for a kind of self-liberation, but also for the liberation of the oppressor, right? This is at the heart of many radical decolonial, anti-colonial treaties, is that the work of forgiveness becomes the capacity and the mechanism for freedom of everyone, right? But in this instance, the mechanism of forgiveness becomes the capacity for the forgiveness of white perpetrators of apartheid violations and the recriminalization of black poor. I'm sorry, I still get so angry. So when the TRC moves into a kind of cause célèbre for an international community, when it moves into a kind of transitional justice technique that can travel and that becomes a kind of exemplar for transitional justice, it's extremely important that we remember and recognize that it's precisely the TRC that becomes a mode of the separation out of a political claim and a claim for the politics of crime, right? It becomes a mode of reckoning with amnesty that recriminalizes poor black people and poor black neighborhoods. So the core mechanism of the TRC, one which is almost always forgotten, was the recriminalization of poor black neighborhoods. And this is also a statistic that is always undermined and forgotten, at the moment where the TRC was doing its amnesty work, there was a 60% increase in rates of incarceration in South Africa. Post-apartheid, right? 60% increase in incarceration rates. So what kind of pathology allows for the kind of generosity of amnesty to become racist? For black generosity to become racist? Who benefits from this historical irony? And what kind of historical process do we need to name it? So I'm not sure if double standards, even though I think it's really important, the kind of conversation we were having yesterday about double standards, I'm not sure double standards gets to the depth of the historical irony that we're witnessing here. Do I have much time? Wrap it up? Okay. So I can go on for a long time. So I think what we're talking about here is not so much double standards, although that's, I think, an important piece in the argument, than about a historical process of obscuring and naturalizing continued workings of racial capitalism. A specific historical process of dispossession within the long history of dispossession and accumulation that is racial capitalism. And I wouldn't want us to think about this process as something that is kind of nameable and separatable outside of a really important conversation about how we place that within the ongoing work of dispossession and accumulation. Okay, so, but to go to the double standards argument a little bit more carefully, the Legal Resources Center, which is a very important legal organization in South Africa, is in the process of reopening cases with the National Prosecuting Authority from the TRC archive. So the most recent, the first case and the one that's pending is this one against Ahmed Timol, who died in detention in 1971 in a Johannesburg police cell during interrogation. He was a member of the South African Communist Party. And an apartheid court exonerated the police, believing the story that Timol jumped out of a window in a police station. Last year, the Legal Resources Center reopened the case and found, a black judge found that Timol was murdered. And he was murdered by, in one instance, João Rodrigues, who was one of the policemen involved in that interrogation of Timol. He's still alive, this is him, and he was ordered to stand trial. He then, João Rodrigues then petitioned not to stand trial because he was too old, right? And 10 days ago, a court struck down his second court bid to stay his prosecution on grounds of old age. So he'll stand trial next month. So the politics of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and the politics of amnesty are with us. The LRC has promised to continue with the prosecution of police responsible for the deaths in custody, not only of Timol, but also of Bantu Stephen Biko and Neil Agate. This is the next wave of their court intervention. Biko, he would not have wanted to be a foil in the politics of double standards, right? He would not have wanted to be in any way participating in the processes of the recriminalization of Black poor people. So I want to end with a question, which is, as these trials now reopen the question of amnesty and reopen the question of the politics of apartheid and anti-apartheid, how do we deal with criminalization, and how do we mobilize around these trials in effective ways that both welcomes the reopening of the apartheid archive as well as brings an abolitionist vision to the current moment? Thank you.
Is this working? Yes, okay. Hello, my name is Aparna Polavarapu. As you heard, I am a lawyer, and I work in a law school. And I came here because, so my background is in human rights. I largely focus on women's rights. I traveled here through feminism. I recently, have really taken up looking into restorative and transformative justice mechanisms. And I'm telling you the story of myself because as I was thinking about time and all the questions that Zina posed, I was thinking about how I use it in my own work. And especially in the conversations that I have with my colleagues in the legal academy, but also just in the larger legal community, who all view me as, well, not all, but many, like, I'm odd to them, right? I'm just odd. I'm not Law and Order. I talk about things like restorative justice and incorporating graphic novels into justice initiatives to try to achieve better ends. And that's just weird where I am. Some of the lawyers in the crowd are like, yep. So this entire talk is coming from my place as someone who's interested, who's really trying to work on developing restorative justice or transformative justice, and we can maybe talk about what those words mean later, mechanisms. My interest would be global, but right now I'm also, I've got a specific focus in South Carolina. which for those of you who know the politics of the Southeast also know that that presents its own set of challenges. And I feel like what I'm constantly coming up against and what I find myself falling into is that we treat incarceration as this, or the carceral approach as this kind of monolith, right, that's rooted in the very core of humanity. And what do I mean by that? I mean that there's so many people can't imagine incarceration not being the central project, right, the default. Like, this is naturally what occurs. So anything you offer to me maybe makes sense in a limited context with limited parameters, but I don't see how you can present something as a larger, systematic, widespread initiative, right? Because it's incarceration all the way. And these same people will acknowledge to me, you know, incarceration does not achieve its intended goals. It's not a deterrent. It can cause a lot of harms. There are like all sorts of collateral consequences. There's lots of work in the legal academy on this. But still, there's this block, right? And thinking about what Zina asked, right, I've thought a lot about how looking to the past can maybe help us reframe that conversation, at least to lawyers. And there are two ways I think about it. One is, first, the challenge is to show that incarceration is not inherently a legal project, right? And by legal, I mean not illegal versus legal, but just something that is natural to lawyers, right? That it's just part of what we do, just laws and incarceration, right? When I want to talk about art, everyone, that's odd, but if you want to write about prisons, well, of course, that's legal. That's what lawyers do. And the other way I think that the history can help us is that it helps us reframe incarceration as not the default. As Dr. Gilmore said yesterday, 2 days ago, you know, it's not natural, necessary, and inevitable, right? And I think our look to Western history, but also global history, like taking a transnational approach, can really make that clear. So I want to start with that first point about incarceration not being inherently legal, and I'm going to kind of speed through these. So if you want more detail, please ask later. When my colleagues who focus on criminal law talk about you know, criminal justice and incarceration, they're often discussing what the goals are. So you might hear phrases like, well, there's an expressive value to justice, right? So when the state says that something's illegal and we throw people in jail, it means that we disapprove of that action, and that's very, very important. A lot of people in the domestic violence field would say, for example, that's why it's so important, right, to throw perpetrators in jail. Deterrence, punishment for crime, rehabilitation, and all of this in the bigger picture of like protection of people and society, right? This is how we protect, this is how we make the world better. Okay, I know that all of you are disabused of that notion. But I think it's also important to note that that's not what penal incarceration is rooted in. So if we were to go back in time to earlier Europe, right? You'll see that penal bondage, like in the 1500s, was often used as a way to get the poor off the streets. So workhouses and prisons were, and to be honest, still are in some places, a source of free labor for the state. Like, keep people inside, profit off of what they do. Houses of refuge or houses of correction were created to reform the poor. Later in time, these eventually began to be seen as places that the poor might go to seek asylum, which of course bothered people. So they thought, well, how can we make this less desirable for the people inside? And another thing happened around the time that this was happening. The Industrial Revolution happened. A lot of these houses stopped being profitable, right? Because human labor just did not produce as much as the machines outside the houses of correction. And so many of these institutions, different institutions, I'm really generalizing here, adopted different approaches, but a number of them began to use labor as a method of torture. Right, so we can't profit, let's try to reform the poor, get them to stop being poor, by putting them in our houses and making it miserable. Okay, and money is a common theme. One thing that did exist for a very long time is debtor's prison. If you owed money, you could be held until a ransom was paid. There are also themes in the past of using confinement to hold, I mean, for lack of a better term, undesirables, especially in families. So I talked about those houses of correction. Wealthy families sometimes would send family members that they considered shameful or embarrassing away to those houses of corrections. Way back in early Rome, there is some evidence that male heads of households, of the wealthier households, would have cells built in their homes so that they could confine, again, embarrassing family members who were acting up, so to speak. Right? So a lot of what is coming out of this is just anti-poor, and also just anyone that's deemed undesirable. Most of the evidence points to the fact that prisons, again, with some limited examples, were not used to address the problem of criminals until much later. So much, much later, the infrastructure was already developing. It certainly wasn't mass incarceration, but it was developing. And at some point, like certain European states started to use them as a place to house convicts. Even later than that, imprisonment later became a reform project in the West. And there's some debate over whether or not the Quakers were involved in this, but at least some are suggesting that the development of a penitentiary in Pennsylvania was spurred by the Quakers pushing back against what were then really terrible punishments and seeing imprisonment as the humane option, right? Regardless, that's how it was presented at the time. So over time, why am I going through all this? Over time, we have started to view imprisonment as something that allows us to address the legal problem of crime, but it is not inherently legal. It did not start out as inherently legal. I don't think it is naturally legal, right? And we can see that from the roots of what it was. And I understand that I gave purely a Western overview just now. But I'm gonna switch to the transnational in a moment, because I think what we also need to show is that incarceration is not default. It's not natural to the human condition, which is kind of the underlying message I get, at least in the human community, in the legal community, when we're talking about incarceration. And looking at comparative historical models helps us reframe this as what it is, really, an experiment, a failed experiment. Restorative justice scholars typically do this to try to find sources of information to inform their own theory. How can we develop a system of restorative justice that works for us today? Let's look at what happened in Native American societies and what still is used in some Native American societies, what happened in pre-colonial Africa, in Asia, and using that to inform their theory of how you can develop restorative justice mechanisms. I think you can take a step further, make it bigger. Use that to show that, like, incarceration, again, is just not the default. It's not natural. It's not something that we have to work around constantly. We can present restorative justice as another pathway, right? There are many ways to think about justice. And here's a caveat, right? The act of confinement is not a purely Western project. Societies around the world have used confinement, but they've also used a number of other methods. Dispute resolution is not all about incarceration. It's not all about the Western-style criminal justice. Fast forwarding to today, if you look at Uganda, Uganda as a country has, the colonial legacy of a criminal justice system and lots of prisons, but also a real interest in preserving the traditional approach of reconciliation. The peace accords that were signed by the Ugandan government and the Lord's Resistance Army focused on reconciliation, right, as a way to resolve the harms that were committed by combatants, especially child combatants, and integrating them back into the community. And this is something that the tribes there, like particularly the Acholi, really were committed to because it was something that was inherent to their understanding of justice. So the point is that these indigenous forms of justice, you know, in the Americas, in Africa, reveal alternatives. And incarceration in a number of these areas spread as a colonial project, right? So in a number of these countries where customary law was, and to be honest, continues to be an important creator of norms, an important controller of behavior, Western-style rights and laws were cited as a reason to deny the application of custom and to impose Western laws and institutions, right? And so those laws and institutions include developing justice institutions, similar to what we see in Europe and in the United States, building prisons, but also other things that are related that we don't think about. For example, trying to demolish communal understandings of land tenure and ownership and imposing title. And by the way, that was way more recent, right? That was around the independence movement of the 60s that was pushed by the World Bank. And that's ended very badly. It just didn't take, and it actually, one of the justifications for title, right, the way we do it here is that it will protect rights, and that ended up actually removing a lot of the rights from a number of people that Western societies don't understand. I'm mindful of the time, so I'm just gonna say a couple of things about some of the difficulties with looking into the past, especially with a legal lens. One particular problem, and this is true of everybody, that comes with looking so deeply into the past, especially when we're looking at the pre-colonial era, where most of our writings are coming from Europeans who are showing up and documenting what they see, is that like you need a really good pair of anti-racism and anti-ethnocentrism goggles, right? It's really, it's hard. It's just, I mean, it's true today, but it's really, you look at those documents and it's just in every statement, right? It's intertwined, and it's hard to separate what people are describing with their immediately racist understanding of what they're seeing. The other issue is how difficult it is to speak another legal language, another justice language. This is very, very hard, even if you're not a lawyer, because your understanding of the law is ingrained in you from birth. If you watch TV as a kid, I don't know, a lot of you are younger than me, but if you watched like He-Man when you were young, I don't know if you remember this, there were little lessons at the end of He-Man, right? And all of those lessons are just repeating American rule of law ideas, right? And that's ingrained in you, right? And that's something that's the first thing I show my comparative law students is clips. I show them Star Trek, I show them He-Man, I just show them lots of TV, and then they're really disappointed on the second day of class when I'm like, now we're reading. But I show them a lot of TV because I want them to understand that what they think is not, what they think is informed by an inherent understanding of justice actually has been shaped from the time that they were a child. So even non-lawyers, when they're trying to understand a completely different approach to justice, it's very difficult. And it's very difficult to turn that off, to understand different concepts. Our words are sometimes just not enough. And we've seen that happen in Africa where lawyers will come in and say, well, here's a law, right? This is a rule, it's a law, I'm gonna write it down. It's not a law, it's a norm. We call it a law because we don't have another word for it. It doesn't work the same way our laws work. Writing it down probably did more harm than good, and in some countries it definitely did. And all of that comes into play when you're trying to look back at this history and to be fair to it, right? To be truthful to it, you've got to try to like dig past the racism, the ethnocentrism, but also your own handicaps, my own handicaps, that just come from being born where I was born, consuming what I consumed, and being trained how I was trained. That being said, I do think that there's quite a lot to learn from it, and that if we are fair to it and honest, we'll see it's not perfect, and I don't recommend romanticizing the past at all, anywhere. But what it does show us, and what I'd like to reiterate, is that incarceration is an experiment. We don't need to treat it like it's something that's inevitable, and this is a way that we can converse, and that I've been working on conversing with others who are so rooted in it that they can't see beyond it. Okay, I'll stop there.
Thanks. Hello. Okay, wonderful. Yeah, hi. My name is Vanessa, and I'm the last speaker on this panel. I hope you still have 10 to 12 minutes maximum of your time. And then we can jump into discussion. I'm really looking forward. I want to thank Zina and Sarah, Karen, and Tobias for the invitation to this important and inspiring conference, and for the labor to making it possible for me to come from Europe. And thank you all for coming out on a Saturday morning. Now, in my short input, which I'm going to read, I will talk a bit about policing in Europe and how it unfolds from the center to the shores and the sea in reciprocal ways, and how Black and of color collectives struggle against policing in Europe. So in many post-colonial contexts of continental Europe, such as Germany, Switzerland, France, but also many other countries, where racism is hegemonically not considered, is however institutionalized and structural, racist policing has become more and more a political issue due to Black, migrant, and people of color organizing and resistances. And in these contexts, the legal regulations do not explicitly operate with race. I mean, Europe is often constructed as this form of raceless racism, but institutional racism is perpetuated and fostered through the relation of racism and migration/mobility. So that means who is constructed as a stranger, migrant, in relation to who is a citizen, to crime, terrorism, which bodies are attached to criminality and deviance, and to space, which places are constructed as safe in relation to the bodies that inhabit these spaces. And while Europe has a very long tradition, you just touched upon it, of producing also critical work on policing, as well as its relation to the liberal law. Just think of Marx's writings on the Paris Commune, or anarchists of critiques of police, Walter Benjamin's critique of violence, Louis Althusser, Michel Foucault, Jean Rancière, etc. The constitutive relationship between policing, racial capitalism, has been violently overlooked. And this has resulted in crucial pitfalls, of which I can only sketch out two here. The first would be the one of what Gominda Bamra calls methodological Eurocentrism. So with regard to how policing is historically understood in most of these theories, the history of police is framed within the national frame of the European nation state. And that erases, of course, that Western European nation states were rather colonial empires than nation states. And they were constitutively producing and reproducing what Ruth Wilson Gilmore calls premature death, the super-exploitation, enslavement, and colonization of racialized populations. So, and this is important, the imperative of national security constitutively went along with the imperative of the securitization of colonial and imperial governance. Now, the second crucial void concerns the realm of subjectivation that Louis Althusser has described through his account of interpellation by the police. Hey, you there. here's a subject and turns around. And according to Althusser, it is through being hailed by the police that the subject becomes a subject. Involved in the logic of law and order, the modern rightful subject not only recognizes its subjectivity, but it further recognizes and desires itself as a subject with rights. And this includes property rights that must be protected. Protected from what or from whom? So Althusser seems to ignore vulnerable subjects in his thoughts on interpellation. Could it be that the subject in Althusser also turns around because it can be relatively sure that it will not experience repressive force by the police? How about individuals and groups whose everyday is impregnated by direct or indirect repressive control of the police? Isn't it most likely that they will try to escape from the control? Here's a banner from a manifestation in the struggle for justice for Theo Louaka and Adama Traoré, mainly waged in the urban Black, Brown, and Muslim working class districts of French outer cities. Now, Theo Louaka was brutalized and sexually violated by the French police in February 2017, and Adama Traoré died in police custody in July 2016. Now, this claim, Theo and Adama, remind us why Ziad and Bouna ran away. Ziad and Bouna, for those who have not heard these names, were actually two of the three youngsters that were escaping from a racist police control in October 2005. And while they were trying to escape, they actually ran into an electricity house and were electrocuted. And that's actually where a lot of insurrections also emerged, like in Paris around 2005 and other French main cities. So this claim, Theo and Adama remind us why Ziad and Bouna ran away, speaks to the condition of constantly being on the run from police and related modes of race punishment, right? So we really see a crucial pitfall even when we think of what Althusser says in terms of subjectivation. And so the experiences of racist policing and struggles of Black folks, migrant, and folks of color against policing, they do not only expose how much of the above-mentioned readings of police smack of colonial complexions, but they further lead the way to radical critiques of and practices against policing that open pathways to new modes of relationality and living together. How do these experiences of policing look like? And I think there are many similarities also now to the US context. So the documentations of anti-racist organizations and people of color collectives describe the manifold and various consequences of racist policing. The appropriation of the racialized bodies via the police, so we can think of it as a property relation, entails a severe restriction of the freedom of movement. The practice of bordering, when bodies become borders, through police interpellation, reproduces societal racism as it replicates the hegemonic representation of police of stopping and searching the right ones, right? So it's not only a practice of police, it funnels back to perceptions in society. Moreover, police subjects have to do the labor of decriminalization of them by themselves, like youngsters telling their teachers, I didn't do anything wrong, or their family members, etc. Policing takes time, as George Lipset writes. This means that racist policing does not end with the end of the actual control. Rather, as various initiatives that struggle against racist policing and racial profiling emphasize, it extends the actual control in time and space and embodiment. Now here Rob Nixon's thoughts on slow violence can be of help, as he describes a form of violence that does not speak to the spectacular events, but is rather dispersed through time and space. Many initiatives against racist policing in Europe have been documenting how police subjects face stress from policing. From the physical and psychological violence it enacts, depression, fear of prosecution, and panic attacks can develop. So there is already this relation between policing and mental health. Further, there are no independent reports offices in continental European contexts. Moreover, and this points to the effects of societal racism, witnesses rarely speak on behalf of the victims of racist policing. Lawyers are also difficult to find, as it is known that legal procedure against the police is rather hard to obtain. So like this, decriminalization of Black people and people of color is reproduced, as they are further constructed as perpetrators, never victims, of police violence who deserve care and protection. Now, a current case in Switzerland demonstrates this. Wilson A., who was stopped and searched by the police on October 10th in 2009 in a tram after he came from a meeting with a friend and asked why the police only checks on him and his friend, was aggressively pushed out of the tram and then brutally beaten. Wilson A. told the police that he has just had heart surgery, but the police continued and even insulted him with racist slurs. As stated in the many reports of support groups and his own testimony, Wilson could barely breathe. Breathing refers to the physical as well as to the social breathing here in a Fanonian framework, and I'm also inspired a bit by Christina Sharp when I think about that. Unbreathing is a crucial and material motive which sticks to the policing of race, especially of blackness, through time and space. Fanon wrote that the colonial condition is characterized by combat breathing. Think of Uri Jallo, who burned in a police holding cell in Dessau while he was handcuffed, and his feet were also cuffed, in Germany, and most likely died from an inhalative heat shock. The black refugee activist, Sister Mimi, who was engaged in the refugee protest at the Oranienplatz and the Gerhard Hauptmann School in Berlin, that those were actually places that were squatted by migrants and refugees and non-citizens, died on December 11, 2014. She continuously argues that the repression by police absorbed her breath. And think of the black bodies in the Mediterranean, losing breath to the waters filling their lungs. The condition of unbreathing is the stuff out of which security, border security, neighborhood security, urban security, national security is produced and its effect simultaneously. This motive of unbreathing or combat breathing travels. I mean, in the US, Eric Garner, I can breathe, his daughter, right? So to really see how this motive, as a material motive, as a condition of unbreathing, travels is very important, and it shows us also the transnational dimensions of what we're actually coming up against. It travels from the transnational to the translocal, from the prison cell and the lager, the detention center, to the urban or domestic space, from the land to the shores and the sea. Wilson A. filed charges. The police officers filed charges too. And after 9 years, the 3 police officers were acquitted. The psychological, physical, and financial constraints that come with such processes are part of the slow violence of and through policing. Black and other racialized subjects are not perceived as victims in the hegemonic economies of perceptions, even if they were the ones who called the police. But also inaction of the police, when black and racialized subjects are in danger, and in many European contexts this really relates to neo-Nazi, neo-terrorist dangers and attacks, burning of refugee houses, etc., and police just standing there. So this inaction also belongs to the modalities of violence of policing. The active inaction by police, in the case of the black asylum seeker, Rita Ovo-Oyongo, who was missed since April 2019 and whose body parts were found in the forest near the Lager, Hohenleimscheid in Brandenburg. The friends and her family continuously pressed that she was missing, so actually nobody was looking for her for over 3 or 4 months. This also speaks to the violence of policing. The slow violence of racial profiling also works through the ways in which family members and friends of police victims are treated by the authorities and institutions. Closing of procedures, or procedures that extend over years, racism during hearings, as in the case of the National Socialist Underground Complex, where the family, so that was a neo-Nazi terrorist group that actually murdered more than 10 migrants in Germany over 10 years. They operated from the underground, and the police actually, when they investigated, they accused the families of the victims of being involved in the killings. So family members and friends experience a continuation of police violence. Racial profiling and the policing of blackness and of race is transtemporal and transgenerational. The sudden death of Uri Jallo's mother, Mariam Jambo Jallo, after she came to Germany a second time during the trial concerning the murder of her son, is part of this form of slow violence. And these accounts demonstrate that the policing of blackness and of race and racist policing are deeply intersectional, right? So black people who live at the intersections of oppressions are particularly vulnerable to murderous policing. Black women, queer, and especially trans and non-binary people, black people with disabilities, working class and poor, black people rendered refugees and asylum seekers, illegalized sex workers. These also show the cases of Christi Schwundeck, who was shot in a job center in Frankfurt am Main on May 19th, 2011, and Mariam Dessa, who was killed on July 14th in 2000 in the house of her white ex-husband. And these are both also very, very crucial cases, because in both cases, actually, their children were involved. Mariama came to pick up her child, and then there was a conflict, and her ex-husband called the police. So it was actually, she was the only black woman in that situation with 4 other people, and at the end she was dead. So I think we really need to think of, when we think of policing, like go beyond the institution of the police, because in especially the cases of Christi Schwundeck and Mariam Sa, the foster care regime as a regime of policing racialized families, poor families, also played a huge role in that. So black initiatives and collectives of color have long criticized and mobilized against racist policing in Europe. And they reveal that an institution which was constituted at the heart of modernity and in alleged protection of democracy actually produces the necropolitical gendered condition of unbreathing. So a lot of these groups and collectives engage in documentation work. This plays a crucial role in order to make this practice even visible, that racist policing exists. But they gather statistics from below, but they don't do that to follow just the logic of judicial evidence, but rather to mobilize racialized communities. But they also engage in legal struggles, thus they are often not won, and institutional racism is reproduced in court cases, but they're still considered as a way to mobilize marginalized community and expose liberal law. Then there are another strategies, also the sensitization of dominant society as part of these programs in forms of like conducting research, reports, video campaigns, workshops, alternative media, and creative interventions. And memory making is also very much part of these struggles, also as a way of collective healing. And these memory-making practices are often very fugitive, right? There are signs, postcards, posters, pictures, and names written on the walls or on the streets to stay connected with those who were murdered and brutalized is also part of these struggles. And the claims of these organizations, and there are many in Europe, and initiatives span actually from the abolition of preventive policing methods to the inclusion of racial policing in anti-discrimination law. Some also call for a ticket system. Moreover, the establishment of independent report and documentation offices is something that most of the groups and initiatives are calling for. But there are also collectives and groups that draw on an understanding of safety that is neither grounded in nor based in structural violence. And departing from the experience of multi-marginalized subjects, Black women and queer, trans of color, Roma and migrant women and queers, for whom policing does not only mean being excluded from the liberal logics of protection and safety, but whom also have to struggle against interpersonal violence within respective communities. Black, migrant, of color, and Roma feminist collectives draw on notions of abolitionist care politics that divest from forms of state security and punishment, which always and already put our lives at risk, and develop collective care practices. Transformative justice is established in many of these contexts through care teams, community accountability, and doing workshops within the community, like being accountable to the community. Also the strengthening of networks of solidarity between anti-prison and anti-police groups, migrant and refugee collectives, sex workers networks, Roma communities, and feminist groups has shown that these struggles are connected in and beyond national contexts. We look out for each other is a slogan of one of the abolitionist cop-watch groups in Germany. It means, on the one hand, that we will protect ourselves from police brutalization and related forms of punishment. On the other, it means that we do not need, quite the contrary, the police to be safe so that we all can breathe. Thank you.
Thank you all very much. As you can see, that was a rich and multivariate bunch of things. So I have many questions, but and many of which were incorporated, I think, into what everyone said. And I'm also very mindful of time and all of you getting a chance to also voice your ideas. So I'm just going to say two kind of themes that I think emerge that are interesting, and then open it up so that we don't run over, because there are many more exciting panels to happen. One of which is that the sort of exposure of the distributional struggles and the kind of various ways in which that gets silenced if we don't look to these particular past archives that all of you are bringing up, I think is really interesting. So, and I would say that from the human rights and transitional justice side, it's something that we've often worried about, that, you know, we critique it as that's invisible. We don't see enough of the kind of history of these struggles as being about the distribution of goods and resources and power. And so in that sense, each of you in different ways, I think, are really bringing out that set of questions, and also the ways in which we think about the past as a place of both violence but also resistance and empowerment. That you know, that if we get to it, each of you, I think, could say much more about that, but in different ways, I think. So thinking about a reparations politics as being a forward-looking as well as a backward-looking set of questions around justice, thinking about sort of redoing the history of how we understand the practices around South African justice as having been also the history about prison riots and about the inequities that were produced at the very moment that it was claiming a kind of equality. So, and to you both as well, right, in different ways, these sort of how these are different, the kind of past-seeking ideas are emerging. So you know, there's a quite, these are all coming from such different places, quite literally. But in that sense, I think there's some very interesting through lines about distribution and the character of the past, and kind of thinking through trauma and violence, but also resistance and dissidence in those ways. But I also want to give a chance, if people have questions, which I imagine you might, to give you a chance to ask them, so that we don't lose our time. And people will come around with microphones, perhaps this one also.
Okay, cool. So I have two questions. I'll make them brief. One for Dr. Farmer. She's my advisor. I have to do this. I love you. How do you think about the potential tension, I shouldn't ask a leading question, the potential tension between reparations activists and the idea of abolition? So I'm thinking about like abolition as an abolition project of capitalism too. How do you think about that tension? And then my second question, I'm honestly a little overwhelmed by like the trauma that was discussed here. And I'm thinking about how in organizing communities, we're starting to have these important conversations about healing justice work in the midst of the work that we do. And so I guess I just want to ask kind of like a large softball question about what these sort of communal forms of care should look like, even within a space like this.
Hi, thank you. I guess from over here. Thank you for this very interesting panel. I was hoping you could talk about the ways in which transformative justice and restorative justice projects can both be a critique of prison and a tool for abolition, but also can reify the state power in applying this. I'm thinking, for example, in Hollow Water in Canada, where there's a lot of transformative work outside of the prison system, but it still requires the Manitoba government's sanction to be able to exist, and still has that threat of prison at the end of it. And so how we can work within the system of state power, but also critique it using these mechanisms.
Yeah, thank you to everyone. I'm just going to throw out something that's been on my mind. The concept of slow violence made me think about. I look at prison healthcare, and I guess I'm just interested in the possibilities and limits in thinking about ideas of health and time when I talk to folks who, the ways in which sort of liberal law can account for ill health outcomes in prison feels very much tied to time. Like when people have like stress outcomes or these things that last long after incarceration, there's really no chance for liberal law that can't address that. And I'm interested in growing conversations around these sort of intergenerational effects of health, epigenetics, stress effects, these health conditions that really challenge the liberal idea of like violence being spectacular and singular and like contained within a linear or very now idea of time. Thanks.
I can start in thinking about the question of the duality of reparations and capitalism. I think the tension you're getting at is exactly right. You've got to petition the very same structure that is oppressing you for the money to do what it is that you want to do. It's not one that any of the women that I studied were not well aware of, and one that they did not continually grapple with. I would say that one of the things that is the limiting factor of reparations is this idea of petitioning to the state, but at the same time, what they wanted to do with the money was where the potential for generative other forms of organizing society worked, right? And I mean, you know, they were seen as ridiculous because they wanted everything from kind of a territorial nationalist claim of going and taking the land and kind of creating these communes that were decidedly anti-capitalist, to being able to take over the government, right? I mean, the range of reparations was difficult. But one of the things I think is the most powerful part of thinking about reparations as a concept is that it is vastly imaginative, and nothing is off the table in terms of that and what can be done. The other thing I want to point out here, kind of also going to your question about trauma, but just to put a point on that, it was a problem. I've not found anybody that effectively dealt with it or solved it. Everybody was kind of throwing up and seeing what stuck. But in terms of going to your question about trauma, one of the things that was key in their discussions about reparations was not just that it's money owed for labor, but when you engage in the act of petitioning or talking about not being whole or needing redress, you are acknowledging that there is a mental, physical, psychological, spiritual part that's been taken from you. And while folks like Queen Mother Moore, I don't think, ever thought that we'd get the paycheck, she thought that the act of thinking and talking about it was a way for us to come together and just heal. Right? Just the act of saying we're going to pull people together and think about what it would mean. And she thought that the idea that we could sit here and imagine possibilities empowered everyday people to do that kind of work. I think her kind of mark in that way, far more than kind of a valid way of distributing money, was thinking about it as a way to be just a restorative psychological and mental project for the communities that she cared about.
Thanks for the questions. I suppose I'll take the transformative justice can be a critique, but can also reify state power. I think we have to think very carefully about at what point and on what conditions we want to insert transformative justice processes that we're experimenting with into state systems, right? So most of the transformative justice processes I know about are run by movements that have no interest in participating in forms of statecraft, right? So how, for example, in queer feminist black movements, how do you not use the carceral state to address sexual violence, right? So how do you pull back the work of accountability into movements to protect people and comrades? But it's hard because comrade rapist is also who does the work of how, and we spoke about this yesterday, right? Who then has to do the work of that kind of accountability and care work, and if it's black women doing the work again. At what point do we start to build at scale a kind of the ideas of transformative justice into something that can be shared equitably, that doesn't require and that's a huge question for the movement right now, is the question of scale and work and labor. It came up yesterday as well. And then I think there was a shared question around bodies and trauma and healing and long-term health. In South Africa, the way in which that's being articulated currently is around the concept of intergenerational trauma. And it's kind of exploded onto a political scene about how you deal with sort of long-term inherited trauma. So not only in the ongoing instances. South Africa also was a place where the social psychologists invented the idea that trauma is not something that's ever passed. It's not a traumatic event. It's an ongoing condition of repeated traumatizing events, which I think probably many of us can relate to that are on this panel. And it's interesting that one of the things that we've been doing in movements is learning how to breathe. So breath work has been a kind of practice of somatic recovery that we've been using in almost every political meeting. And it's uncomfortable and it's hard and it's weird. And those of us that are trained as, anti-capitalist academics have to really push ourselves to do this well. But I've done my training. So I now start political meetings with breath work, right? And it's to think about how to connect, a deep sigh and a kind of strategy for thinking about how to breathe well, which I think is incredibly, it goes incredibly to your comments around the inability to breathe and how important it is to, and I won't give you a lecture, but the exhale actually produces parasympathetic response, which is the capacity to relax and release, right? I mean, there's a physiological anti-trauma work in the exhale. So the capacity to integrate, and I know that Movement for Black Lives has also been working increasingly with somatic practice in movement building. And so I think, for me, the more we can connect political struggle with that kind of work and those kinds of processes and practices, and link them, right? Not just retreat into the practices or retreat into the vanguardist politics, right? It's the connection between them that is the most interesting politics currently. Thanks.
I'll be real quick and just add something to the restorative and transformative question. It's a really good question. And I likewise don't have an exact answer. I want to affirm everything Kelly said, but then also add that it's really hard to avoid the state at times, no matter what you're doing, especially when the state lays claim, exclusive claim, right, to resolving or addressing certain types of crimes. So there's that famous case, and maybe all of you have heard of it, but there's a famous case out of Florida where a young man shot his girlfriend in the head. She was about, less than a foot away from his gun. And, that's a homicide, and that triggers a state response. You cannot get out of the state response. The young girl's parents, after some thought, decided that they wanted to avoid the criminal justice system. So they called a facilitator, and in Florida, right? In Florida. And the woman came, and this is what's remarkable, and this is why I keep saying in Florida, they had to convince the prosecutor who was assigned to the case to allow this to go forward, and he agreed, which was very surprising given the local politics. But he had to be part of it, right? There was no way that was going forward without his participation. The state would never allow that, but it was that or nothing, right? And I guess that's why I'm telling you this story, that sometimes it's be complicit or nothing. It's bring in the state or nothing at all, and they'd rather move forward with this mechanism. And at the same time, I think it was very valuable, and it was even valuable to bring in someone from that office to understand what it's like to have a non-adversarial system of justice, and to see how much this girl's parents got out of having a series of conversations, how much even this young man began to heal himself and understand why he did what he did, and get to a much better place than I think he would have if he had just been a defendant brought in the adversarial American US system. So I think even that act, even though it is part of the state, creates a relatively small, but still an opportunity for revealing a critique to a state actor.
Okay. Yeah, I just wanted to say something on the question of like trauma and how, it in a way also gets reproduced when we talk about it, like the forms of violence our communities experience. And at the same, so there's something I learned from Mimi, the sister Mimi, the organizer who is not with us anymore, because she used to say, like, even within these struggles, like as a Black non-citizen in Germany, like being attacked from so many sides, that it's important that we focus on life. And although like telling these stories to also show, especially I think when we travel to various contexts, to know, because in Europe, for example, a lot of people, they know who Oscar Grant is, they know who Sandra Bland is, but very often when I travel to the US, I see it's very one-directional in terms of how transnational solidarity is thought, and I think we have to have more horizontal conversations, and that also entails telling these stories. And at the same time, there's a fine line between telling the stories and like reproducing the circle of violence. So for me, like in terms of when I, in the presentations, I try to focus on pictures of people when they live. I don't, for example, show images of Black bodies drowning the sea, but because that's actually what also this visual form of violence, right? The spectacularization, the normalization of seeing bodies dying. To counter that in a way, but to still tell these stories. And at the same time, I think in terms of how we deal with this in these halls or in the university or in this space is then really breathing, like taking the time also to breathe or exhale, and also, taking care of each other, and try to focus on life practices, and try to focus on life also means like be thankful that we are here, and the responsibility that comes with that, like not only in this space, but how do certain people leave this space? Like how do refugees and non-citizens that might be here, multi-vulnerable subjects, how do they come home? Like what's then? Would they need, like, do we need further support? In terms of not being in this space together, but also leaving, coming, etc. So to really think of care in this movement sense.